Hey everybody, my name is Jason, also known as Pirate JC, and welcome to another Babylon video. Today I am beyond pumped because we get to embark on an absolutely epic adventure together. We're going to go from the very beginning of the process through every single step all the way to the very end and create this together. This dancing morph targets demo. This Tron-like inspired hypnotic demo. And we're going to do it every single step of the way, starting in this very video. But before we dive in, there's something very important that you need to know. This is not going to be a straight path to the end result. We're not going to take the fastest path or the most efficient path. This entire video series, I'm calling it the tech artist journey, because we're going to go through a winding, crazy path where we're going to learn all kinds of different techniques and different tools and leverage new things that you might not have experienced before in order to bring us to that demo. I want you to think of this video series as like you would a hike through the woods. It's not the most direct path to the top or to the end of the trail, but it is going to be beautiful, and there's going to be twists and turns and challenges, and we're going to learn some new things together. And I promise you, you will learn something new through the course of this video. So thank you so much for coming along, and our journey today kicks off at the very beginning in a program called Blender. That's right, this Babylon video, the series, is going to start off in one of the most popular 3D authoring applications in the world. It is called Blender. If you're not familiar with Blender, please go check it out. You're going to want to download it. It's totally open source and free, and it is absolutely amazing. It actually looks just like this. This is Blender. You will see your good friend, what's the joke is it's called the default cube. That's in your starting scene. And let's go ahead and kick it off and get started right here. I'm going to hit A on the keyboard, and I'll walk you through everything that we're doing along the way so that if this is your first time opening Blender, no worries at all. You'll be able to follow along. I'm going to hit A on the keyboard to select everything, and then I'm going to hit delete because I don't want the default cube, camera, or light that comes in the scene. So we have a fresh scene here, and I'm going to start by creating a plane. Now there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can go up to the Add menu or hit Shift A and bring up the Add menu, either way. And then we're going to want to grab a plane, okay? Now that plane is going to come in. There's a little tiny caret above our 3D axes up here, this little caret icon, which you can click and drag out, or you can hit N on your keyboard to pop it out. You'll notice that the dimensions here that are listed for this plane are 2 meters by 2 meters by, of course, 0 meters because it's a flat plane. I want to change these dimensions to be 0.25, 0.25 by 0, okay? And so it's going to be a little bit smaller than when it first comes in. The next thing that I want to do is I actually want to start to modify this just a little bit. We need to start turning it into kind of a bar shape. And not every single piece along this journey is going to make 100% sense at this moment, at the part of the video, but it will come in handy later. So I promise we'll allude to things along the way that will come in handy later, and they will eventually make sense. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to grab the edges of this and we're going to scale it in or extrude it in. And we can do that by selecting the object. We can click on it. And I'm going to hit Tab to enter edit mode. You can also enter edit mode up here in this menu right here. So I'll hit Tab to go over to edit mode. Now, by default, there's 3 different ways that you can select pieces of your mesh in edit mode. By default, it's vertex selection that's on. The next one over is edge selection, and the final one is face selection. I'm going to hit 2 on my keyboard, or you can hit this button either way to get to edge mode. And now what I have is I have the 4 edges of this plane selected, okay? And I'm going to hit E for extrude, and then I'm going to hit S for scale, and I'm just going to start to drag these in a little bit until we have a little bit of a lip around the outside. And I just clicked to commit to the change that I wanted. So now you can see I've got this plane in the middle, and I've got these faces on the outside that are going to be a lip for our bar, because we want the bar itself to be inset from the outer bounds of the mesh by just a little bit. But I also have a problem that I've introduced, which is if I were to take this and I were to move it up, don't worry about how I did that, you'll notice that I still have a face here on the bottom, which I don't want. And so what I need to do is I need to select that entire bottom face, but I'm still in edge select mode. So I need to hit 3 on my keyboard to get to face select mode. And then you can click around until you get a plane that looks like it's covering up the entire bottom part of your mesh, and go ahead and hit delete and delete faces. And now what you'll see is when I move this up, now I have no face on the bottom, which is exactly what I want, okay? All right, so now what I want to do is I want to extrude this face up like a bar. And so I'm just gonna hit E with the top middle face selected here. I'm gonna hit E. And by default, Blender will assume that you want to extrude perpendicular to the face that you've selected. So this is directly up in this case, which is what I want. And so now I'm going to hit 0.25 and I'm going to bring it up. I actually hit 0.256, didn't I? There we go, 0.25. And I'm going to commit that by hitting enter. And so now I have this basic bar, beginning of a bar shape. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that this demo that we're going to be creating, these dancing bars, it's using morph targets. Now, if you're not familiar with morph targets, it is an incredibly powerful concept in three-dimensional experiences, where you can take a base mesh, but you can change the position of the vertices so that they have different positions and you can influence between them. This is very common in facial animation. So if you have kind of an open mouth shape, you can actually modify that slightly on one side of the face to kind of get like that kind of a vibe going. And you can do that not by individually rigging them, but actually storing different positions and then animating between those positions. And in the Babylon world, we call those morph targets. In the Blender world, they're known as shape keys. And to make it even more complicated, in other 3D authoring tools such as Autodesk software, they're known as blend shapes. But they're all interchangeable and they all mean the exact same thing. So let's go through the process of creating a shape key together, okay? We're gonna hit Tab to go back to object mode. I have object mode, and we're gonna go in this panel here. We're actually gonna go to the icon that says Object Data Properties. I'll get my camera back on here. It's that green one, and you'll see that I have vertex groups and I have shape keys, okay? What I want to do is I want to hit the shape key plus button twice, okay? 1, 2. Now the first thing that's created is called basis. This is you telling Blender, this is the starting positions of all of the vertices of this mesh. This is essentially the base mesh. And then this key 1 is going to be our ability to manipulate and change that. So let's do that now. We're going to go to edit mode, okay? We're gonna grab, make sure that key 1 is selected, and we're gonna grab that top face, and we're gonna move it up by 2 units. Very, very easy. I'm gonna hit G on the keyboard, okay? Now G by default will move all around. We don't want that, so I'm gonna hit G, and then I'm gonna hit Z to constrain it to the up and down the Z axis. And then we're going to hit 2 to move it up 2 units, okay? And you'll notice as I scroll out here, zoom out, that I have now my bar up 2 units. Okay, so let's go back to object mode by hitting Tab again. And you'll notice that we snap back down to our basis mesh. This is essentially what happens with shape keys or morph targets. You'll notice that this key 1 has a value here of 0. Essentially what that's saying is that taller version of that mesh that we made, that shape key, we don't want any influence from that whatsoever. If I were to click and drag this out to 1, that's 100% influence, meaning I want these vertices up here that were changed. I want them to be 100% weighted towards their positions in key number 1. I can also do that halfway as well. If I put 0.5, that's halfway of the influence between the original base mesh and the final positions that I created for key number 1, okay? And so we have this key now that's available, and we have the base mesh. Now it's important to know that if you ever change your base mesh, you will in fact be changing the keys as well, the shape keys, because the shape key is a difference, a positional difference from the base mesh. That's an important thing to remember, and we're actually going to use it to our advantage later. Okay, so now we have a bar, and we have a single shape key that has it animated all the way up. Excuse me, not animated, but positioned all the way up. Okay, now we're gonna go into our first crazy twisty turn, okay? This is the first part of our hike through the woods that's gonna be kind of a mind-boggling thing. And this is where some of the mastery of tech art really shines. When you realize that there's so many things that you can do outside of the beaten path in the computer graphics world. And what we're going to do is we're going to use not one, not two, but three individual UV maps for this particular 3D object. Is that kind of crazy? A UV map, if you're not familiar with what it is telling the 3D object how a two-dimensional picture gets wrapped around it, like a texture how it gets wrapped around the 3D object. Okay. You can have control over that. You can map something top down and wrap it around from the top or from the side or from the bottom. You can choose how an image is wrapped around a 3D object. And that's the art of creating UV maps. And we're going to do 3 of those. And it's not going to be immediately clear why we're doing 3 of these. That's actually going to come quite a bit later in our video series, but we need to start that process now so that when we create a node material later to shade the bars, that cool Tron-like effect, different parts of the mesh are being influenced in different ways from that node material. I know that's kind of mind-boggling. Don't worry, it'll all make sense as we get through this series later on. But to start, we're going to go up to this tab and hit UV editing, okay? Now you're presented with 2 different views here. You're presented with a 3D view that you're familiar with and a 2-dimensional top-down view that this box represents what you might think as the texture, how this is going to be mapped onto the 3D object. And so I'm going to open up this UV maps section here, and you'll notice that every 3D object inside of Blender comes with a single UV map, and we want to add to that. So I'm going to hit plus, and again, I'm going to hit plus one more time so that I have 3 of them. Now, to make this easy on ourselves, let's rename the first one to be top down all, okay? And then we're going to name the second one top face, all right? And then we're going to name the last one side faces. Now this will all be clear later, but essentially we're going to weight the wrapping of UVs around certain parts of this bar to again suit our needs later. So let's start with top down all. We're going to make sure that's selected. That's important. And we're going to hit all. Okay. We're going to hit, A for all. And you'll notice that everything here is stretched out to the outer bounds. Okay. We want to do a top down projection. And I'm doing that by hitting Z. And I want it to stretch so that it's perfectly top down, basically a straight orthographic projection down. And so I'm going to hit UV. I'm going to go project from view bounds and watch what happens. It is going to then essentially do exactly what we wanted, where I now can see a direct one-to-one correlation of a top-down view of our mesh. And so the texture that I would wrap around this with this first UV map would be a top-down mapping. It would basically be projecting an image directly from the top down onto our 3D object. Okay, so now let's get into the second one. This is where we get a little bit more interesting. With our second one, let's select different faces here and see what's happening. Our side face is actually down here on the bottom. You can see those 2 vertices here. Our top face is stretched over the entire bounds of the UV map of the texture space. And then our lip is actually compressed into this thin line at the bottom as well. So this is not what we want. We want this entire object, all of the vertices to be squashed to the very center of this image, okay? And again, this will make sense as to why we're doing this later, but for now, just follow along that we're doing it. So we're gonna hit A to grab everything, okay? And then I wanna hit A again in this window, and I want to hit Shift S, cursor to selected. And what that does is it takes this cool crosshair, it's called the 2D cursor in this view, and it takes this cool crosshair and pops it to the very center of all of the things that I have selected. So it is now in the very center of this entire, this mapped area here, the UV bounds, okay? Now what I want to do with everything selected is hit S and then 0, and you'll notice that everything pops right to the middle. Now actually, this is slightly misleading. The first thing I'm supposed to do is actually make sure under this pivot that I have 2D cursor selected. Not a big deal, same result technically with the current setup that I have. But what this will do is snap all of these, when I scale them, to wherever that 2D cursor is. Let me show you the difference just real quick. I'll move this over here. With the bounding box center, I'll hit scale and 0, and it'll end up in the center. Okay, but if I change it to 2D cursor and hit S0, it'll put everything into the center of this 2D cursor. Okay, not a huge deal. Basically, again, to go through that, Shift S, cursor to selected, and then I'm going to hit Make sure this is on 2D cursor up here, this pivot point. Grab everything, S0, and now it's in the very, very center. Okay, now let's grab our top face. Make sure that we are looking straight down in it by hitting this Z up here. And then I'm going to say UV, project from view, bounds, okay? And now the top face goes all the way to the outer bounds of the UV map, but everything else is in the center. This side face is mapped to the center, the lip is mapped to the center, everything here is mapped to the center other than this top face. And that's what we want for this top face UV map. Now let's click on side faces, okay? And we're gonna do a similar thing. We'll grab everything, make sure it's all selected, hit S for scale and type in 0 to scale it to 0 scale, right in the center. And now we're gonna do a very similar thing, but just for these side faces here, okay? So let's grab one. We'll make sure we hit the appropriate part of the 3D manipulator, the view, to look directly onto that face. And I'm gonna hit UV, project from view, bounds, okay? And there it maps to the outer bounds of the UV map. We'll go over to this face. We'll do the same thing, hit this X, UV, project from view, bounds, and we're gonna do the same thing for all 4 faces, okay? UV, project from view, bounds, and then finally this last face, UV, project from view, bounds. Okay, so now what we have is our top faces in the middle, our lips are mapped to the middle of the UV map, and then the side faces are all stretched to the outer bounds. So our UV maps are now set up and we are good to go. Okay, let's make sure that top down all is selected and we'll go back to layout mode. And we essentially now are at the place where we have a plane that's been modeled, very, very rudimentarily modeled into a bar. And then we've extended the positions of the top face with a shape key, and then it has 3 UV maps attached to it. That's pretty bonkers so far, right? Okay, so now what we're in a place where we can do is we can start to build out a mesh where we've got a grid of these bars that's 16 long by 4 wide, okay? And we can do that by starting to duplicate this mesh. So let's go ahead and hit Shift D with the mesh selected, and you're in object mode. Shift D, okay? And then I'm gonna hit X to constrain my movement to the X axis. And then I'm gonna hit 0.25 to get it to move over and nudge up directly next to the previous one, okay? I'll hit Enter to commit that, and we're gonna go through that process again. A to select everything, Shift D, X to constrain it to X, and this time I'm gonna move it over by 0.5, 0.5. I went too far. What did I do wrong? There we go. Had one too many digits there. Okay, hit Enter to commit. We'll hit A to select everything, Shift D, X to constrain it to X, and this time we're gonna do 1, and we're gonna do this one final time. We now have 8 of these things. Let's grab all of them, Shift D, X, and we'll hit 2 to get to 16. Okay, now same thing, hit A, Shift D. This time we're gonna hit Y to constrain it into the Y axis, okay? And we're gonna hit 0.25. We'll do it again, A, and we'll hit Shift D, Y, 0.5. And now we have all of the copies, there's technically 64 of them here, of the bars that we want. And here's what's cool. Every time we made a copy, we have this shape key that knows what the position of those top vertices are when the influence is all the way up. So if I click on a random duplicated mesh here, it also has the inherited shape key. Okay, very, very cool. So now we want to combine all of these into a mesh, okay? And we can do that by hitting A, and this is where the next part of our journey is going to take kind of a rocky turn here. If you hit Control J, actually, before we do this, go ahead and save. Now is a great time to save this file so that you can pick up right where you left off if anything goes awry, because something is going to go awry. We're going to hit, after you've saved, we're going to hit Control J, okay? And when I do this, notice that I now have one single mesh. They've all been combined into one mesh, but let's go down and look at shape keys. We have a problem. Our problem is that it has seen that each individual bar that I had and tried and I combined had a single shape key that was called key 1. And so it combined them all together into one massive shape key, which is not what I want. I want one single mesh, but I want it to have 64 different shape keys. And so this is a major, major problem that's actually going to be pretty fun to solve together. With that though, I'm actually going to stop it right there for this video. We'll call this one quits. Thank you so much for kicking off this epic journey with me. I hope you've learned something. If you're new to Blender, new to the 3D world, I hope this has been an exciting first step for you. In our next video, we're going to go through using Blender's Python API to be able to rename shape keys without having to do it individually and manually. Thank you so much again for coming on this journey with me. This first video has been a lot of fun, and the rest are going to be just as much, if not more fun. If you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to this channel so that you don't miss any future updates, and we'll see you next time.